Hello, in this video I'm going to give an overview to the nervous system and talk a little bit about nervous tissue. So first I want to start by talking about the functions of the nervous system. So the main functions of the nervous system are to sense information about stuff happening inside and outside of our body, integrate that information, and then decide what to do about that information, and then possibly send out motor commands. So that's a lot of stuff if you think about it, and the nervous system has to do all of that. And the nervous system takes the sensory input, it integrates the information, and it decides on the output. And it's doing this in order to basically make us function properly. To do things like help us use our skeletal muscles or make our heartbeat faster or slower. The nervous system is doing this in order to maintain homeostasis. And the nervous system works very closely with another body system to maintain homeostasis. And this other body system is the endocrine system. The nervous system is a lot faster than the endocrine system, but the nervous system does require direct connections in order to send that output message. So in other words, you have to have a nerve going to a target organ in order for the nervous system to communicate with that target organ. Whereas the endocrine system is slower, but it can pretty much go anywhere because endocrine system uses hormones, which are chemical messengers that travel through body fluids. And any place where you have a body fluid, you can send a hormone. So the endocrine system is more widespread. The hormones of the endocrine system are much longer lived compared to nervous system signaling. You have hormones that are in your bloodstream right now that have been there for a couple weeks. And this is much less costly in terms of energy. In order to send a nervous system signal straight for 2 weeks, that would require a lot of ATP energy. But we can take a hormone and release it into the bloodstream, and that just takes a little bit of energy, and then that hormone lasts for quite a long time. So now I'd like to talk about the classification of the nervous system, or how we divide the nervous system. So first of all, we have the central nervous system, or CNS, and this is composed, gross anatomically, of the brain and spinal cord. Now, in order to get messages to the brain and spinal cord, and in order to take messages away from the brain and spinal cord, we're going to use the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. The main organs of the peripheral nervous system are nerves. They could be cranial nerves, which are nerves attached to the brain, or spinal nerves, which are nerves attached to the spinal cord. We have some further subdivisions in the peripheral nervous system. We can have sensory or motor commands being sent along the peripheral nervous system. Sensory commands are the incoming commands. So this is information coming from the senses, such as like vision or taste or touch or pain. And that information is traveling towards the central nervous system. Another term for this is afferent. Afferent means to go towards a center. So this is going towards the central nervous system. So sensory and afferent are both the same thing. If a command is leaving the central nervous system and going to a muscle or gland, that would be the motor division. Motor is also called efferent. Efferent means to go away from the center. So in this case, we're going away from the central nervous system towards something like cardiac muscle in the heart, or smooth muscle in your intestines, or skeletal muscle or gland. Now, if we look at the motor division, we can further separate that into somatic and autonomic divisions. The somatic division is the voluntary portion of the motor division. So this would involve your skeletal muscles because you have voluntary conscious control over the contraction of your skeletal muscles. Somatic means of the body, and it usually refers to things like skeletal muscles. The autonomic division is the involuntary division of the motor division. And the autonomic division, you can kind of think of it as being automatic. It's handling those things in your body that occur involuntarily or automatically, if you will. So this is like doing things like helping your heart beat faster or slower, or increasing or decreasing your respiratory rate when you exercise, So the autonomic division is controlling your cardiac muscle, your smooth muscles, and your glands. And then we can further subdivide the autonomic division into parasympathetic and sympathetic. The parasympathetic division is also known as the rest and digest division, because the parasympathetic division is the one that is in control of your involuntary body functions when you're resting, which is most of the time. So the parasympathetic division tends to slow down most of your involuntary body activities. It slows down your heart rate, slows down your respiratory rate, that kind of thing. So it's your rest and digest division. We call it digest division because when you're resting, that's a good time to digest your food. So the parasympathetic division decreases most involuntary body activities with the exception of digestion. Digestion is increased under the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic division is the opposite. This is your fight or flight division. The sympathetic division helps prepare you for stressful or dangerous circumstances. So the sympathetic division is like your emergency division. It increases most of your involuntary body activities. It increases your heart rate. It increases your respiratory rate. But it does decrease digestion because if you're in an emergency situation, that's a bad time to digest your food. So it suppresses digestive system activities. Now let's take a look at nervous tissue. So nervous tissue tends to contain two types of cells. Neurons, which are the main cell type, and these are the cells that are going to be performing the electrical and chemical communication of the nervous tissue. And then the other cell type are neuroglial cells, or also sometimes just called glial cells. And these are support cells that are helping out the neurons. So first let's take a look at a neuron. So like I said, neurons are performing the high-speed electrical and chemical communication for nervous tissue. And neurons have a specific structure to them. Okay? They have a main region to them where you find most of their organelles, and this is called the cell body, also known as the soma. So the cell body contains the nucleus, the mitochondria, and many other organelles for the neuron. Coming off of the cell body are several long extensions, and these are sometimes also called fibers. And these can be classified according to whether they're bringing a signal in towards the cell body or away from the cell body. Dendrites are extensions that are bringing signals into the cell body, whereas the axon is an extension that is taking a signal away from the cell body. Now the axons are really important because the axons are going to be the structures on the neuron that experience the electrical event known as a nerve impulse or an action potential. So I want to talk a little bit more about these axons. At the very end of the axon you find something called an axon terminal. One axon can have several axon terminals. And the axon terminal contains vesicles, which are bubble-like structures that contain within them neurotransmitters. And the neurotransmitters are the chemical signaling molecule used by the nervous system. Axon terminals are separated from the next neuron by a small space called the synaptic cleft. So what's going to happen is when an axon experiences a nerve impulse, the nerve impulse will cause the release of the neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. And the neurotransmitters will then travel to the neighboring cell and possibly cause a nerve impulse to be sent along that neighboring cell. A synapse is the word we use to describe a place where a neuron and another cell meet. So on the screen here we see an example of a synapse. Okay? We can see the axon terminal of our sending neuron, and then we can see our receiving neuron. Now don't forget the dendrites are the parts that bring a signal in, so on the receiving neuron we're looking at the end of a dendrite here. Now a little bit more about these helper cells to the neurons. So these are called glial cells or neuroglial cells, and there are many types of neuroglial cells, and they each have a different job. Astrocytes, for example, are going to be neuroglial cells that coat capillaries in the brain and spinal cord and create something called the blood-brain barrier. Ependymal cells are neuroglial cells that help us to make a fluid in our brain and spinal cord called cerebrospinal fluid. Microglia are glial cells that are sort of like the garbage trucks of the nervous system, and they're capable of cleaning up dead cells and debris. And then we have oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells. And these two types of glial cells wrap themselves around the axons of neurons, forming structures called myelin sheaths, which help to insulate the axons, allowing for a nerve impulse to travel very quickly along the axon. So, in summary, glial cells are there to support, protect, and insulate neurons. I want to talk a little bit more about these myelin sheaths that are formed by both oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells, which are types of glial cells. The myelin sheath is essentially insulation on the axon. Because the myelin sheath is composed of basically a glial cell wrapping around the axon, and because glial cells have cell membranes, basically the myelin sheath is just a bunch of cell membranes wrapping around an axon. And if you remember, cell membranes are made of lipids. So essentially, we just have a bunch of fat that makes up the myelin sheath. And fat makes a really good insulator. So these myelin sheaths insulate the axon, allowing for a nerve impulse to travel really quickly down the axon. You'll notice in the picture here that the myelinated axon is transmitting a nerve impulse much faster than the unmyelinated axon. What I want to do now is talk a little bit about where we find neuron cell bodies and where we find neuron axons in the body. So cell bodies are a lot denser than axons. They have a lot more stuff in them because they have all those organelles inside of them. So they appear darker. Denser things appear darker when you look at them. So when we look at nervous tissue, we sometimes see these darker areas and these lighter areas. We call that gray matter and white matter. So gray matter of the nervous system tends to be composed of cell bodies, whereas white matter tends to be composed of axons. So in this picture here of the brain, we can see an area labeled gray matter, which appears a little bit darker, and then an area labeled white matter, which appears very white. The gray matter here is composed of neuron cell bodies, whereas the white matter is composed mostly of axons. If you recall, many axons are coated with the myelin sheath, which is essentially fat, and fat does appear lighter or white, hence the white matter. Now, we can find clusters of neuron cell bodies. Clusters of neuron cell bodies in the central nervous system are referred to as nuclei, and clusters of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system are referred to as ganglia. Now, with regards to axons, bundles of axons in the central nervous system are referred to as tracts, whereas bundles of axons in the peripheral nervous system are referred to as nerves. So in the picture here on the right, we can see something labeled the optic nerve and the optic tract, right? Essentially, both of these are bundles of axons. It's just one is in the peripheral nervous system, the optic nerve, and the other is located in the brain itself, so it's in the central nervous system, and that would be the optic tract.